Hello everyone, I'm Priyadashni Mahara, faculty at the Department of Buddhist Studies, University of Delhi. Today, I would be discussing with you module number 23. This module constituted in paper number 11 of Philosophy of Buddhism. The title of this module is Doctrine of Probability Vinyan. Now, before we get into what Pravritti Vinyan is, let us first see what does this term Vinyan means. Why we are using this term Vinyan is that, or why we are first defining this term Vinyan, because Vinyan is the common term which you might have already studied, or you would be studying this particular term in further modules. So, we would be talking about what Vinyan is. It is widely used in Buddhism, and in English it is termed as consciousness, knowing, or awareness. However, when we look at this English translation of the term Vinyan, we see that we've tried to use here the closest possible synonyms and the closest possible translation. When you look at any translated work, you see that a particular work in a particular language means something, and once you translate it, it somewhat loses its essence. I am not saying that this happens all the times, but yes, mostly, you don't get that sort of feeling or essence of that work. So here, when we are using awareness, knowing, or consciousness, these are only the closest translations of Vinyan. Now, when we look at this word Vinyan, we see that in this Sanskrit word arises from the root Gya, which means to know. The prefix V is defined or defines the separation or division. And then it acts as an awareness and cognition to notice or observe. Two words that are also commonly translated are mind as Chit and Manas. Sometimes it is denoted by other name called heart-mind. And this is so because it is the state of mind which represents the feeling more than thoughts. So the role of mind is to take the intellect and make judgments. Even in the modern context, the translator render all these words by mind or awareness. A lot of meaning gets lost when there is this sort of translation. Now, when we look at Vinyan as we have studied till now, it means awareness, consciousness. It can also be called mind, manas, or chit. So it is also one of the skand. When we talk about skand are the 5 aggregates, which is the collection of components that make an individual. If you remember, then in our 4 Noble Truths, we began with talking about skand. So Panchupadan Skand means 5 aggregates. These aggregates together form an individual. And these 5 aggregates are the aggregates of feeling, aggregates of form, aggregates of perception, aggregates of discrimination, aggregates of consciousness. Therefore, we have form, feeling, perception, discrimination, and consciousness. Therefore, Vinyan Skand is also usually translated by various scholars as consciousness or awareness. Vinyan is one of the 6 faculties which is called mind, and this helps in corresponding the phenomena as its object. For example, when we talk about the mental consciousness, we see that mental consciousness has the mind which acts as a basis and idea or thought of an object. Aggregate of consciousness is that intersection of organ and object. When we talk about aggregate of consciousness, we see when the knower comes in contact with the known, there is that consciousness that arises. So here we say that it is the intersection of organ and object. So here when we talk about organ, it is not just one organ that gives about a consciousness. It is the sense organs that lead to the object, like the object of, suppose for that example, let us take eye. So the object of eye would give out eye consciousness. Object of ear would bring about ear consciousness. Object or sound consciousness. Object of nose will bring about odor consciousness. Likewise, object of tongue will bring about taste consciousness. Therefore, the pure awareness that is obtained is through the organ and object contact or consciousness. Now, when we look at Vinyan, it is also third of the 12 links of dependent origination. Without this 12 link, the dependent origination becomes consciousness and nothing else. So, when we talk about dependent origination, we see that there are these 12 links. Now, what are these 12 links? 12 links are the 12 factors that define a particular individual. So, every factor gives rise to its other factor. So, there is that cause and effect relationship in Pratitya Samutpad. When we look at the first cause, it is ignorance or avidya. Second one, ignorance gives rise to second cause, and that is Nam Roop. Nam Roop gives rise to Vinyan. So Vinyan is the third of the 12 links of dependent origination. When we talk about Vinyan in dependent origination, it further gives rise to other factors, they further giving rise to some other factors. So together, what we're trying to say here is that Vinyan points out to that mind, that awareness which is present in the wheel of life or the wheel of suffering, which is known as Pratitya Samutpad in Sanskrit and Paticca Samutpad in Pali. Now, when we look at Vinyan, we see that consciousness defined by Yogacara school emphasizes that Vinyan is real, but object of awareness are unreal. Before we further go ahead in this, let us see what does Yogacara state. So we have Yogacara school, and on the other hand we have Madhyamik. They both belong to the Mahayana sect of Buddhism. So when we look at Yogacara, Yogacara states that nothing cannot be real, it is only the mental that is real, and anything that lies beyond the mind is unreal. Whereas for the Madhyamiks, nothing is real. For them, neither mental nor non-mental is real. So you see the difference between the two schools. One says that there is nothing that is real, neither mental nor non-mental is real. And the other one, which is the Yogacara school, holds up that only mental is real. And for them, anything that lies outside the mind, be it body or other object, they are all unreal. When we talk about mind, why do they even consider mind to be real? It is because in order to make any thinking possible, you need to at least accept the reality of mind. So that is what is Vinyan according to them. Vinyan is real, but the objects of awareness are unreal. They think as the external objects are creation of consciousness. So for the Yogacara school, when we talk about the external objects, they are considered to be mere mental constructions and nothing more than that. Yogacara has as its primary concern the nature of consciousness and the nature of experience. So consciousness and experience hold primary importance in Yogacara school. It merely deals with idealism. So that is the reason Yogacara school can be called idealism. The central problem, however, in Yogacara philosophy is about logical synthesis of idealism and absolutism. When we talk about idealism, or when we call Yogacara school an idealistic school, why? Because for them only Vinyan or mind is that what is real. Anything that lies outside is unreal. And this subjective idealism brings about certain critical issues. However, Yogacharans contend that subjectivity, though the source of unreality, is real. So they say that when we talk about subjectivity, though it is the source of unreality, it is in a way real. The main target is to reach the ground of all phenomena. According to Yogacara, object does not appear and cannot be service to knowledge. It is therefore unreal. When we talk about object, according to the Yogacharans, it is not there and cannot be of any service to knowledge. Therefore, it is called unreal. Consciousness is the sole reality and the object is just a mode of consciousness. When we look at consciousness, we say that it is a mere reality and the object are just modes of that consciousness. In the text of Yogacara, Samadhi Nirmochan Sutra, as the doctrine of Yogacara inaugurated the paradigm of the three turning of the wheel of Dharma, with own tenets in the third turning. Yogacara text synthesizes all three turnings through various discourses. Vasubandhu's stress on ideation only is consistent with the standard doctrine of Buddhism through all its periods, that the person whose mind is stabilized or concentrated sees things as they really are. From the beginning, the theory was that an entity can be somehow visualized mentally in better, more real or truer form than in ordinary sense perception. When we talk about a particular entity and we talk about the visualization of that entity, we see that in mental formation it is better, more real or truer form than in ordinary sense perception. To remove error and illusion, one has to do something about the foundations of mind, rehabilitate or transform it. In order to remove any sort of error, one has to do something about the foundations of mind, either rehabilitate it or transform it. In an ethical sense, the acts of speech and body are dependent upon the acts of mind. The latter are the real villain or saint. In yoga training, one should transfer the object to the mind, then eliminate all mental strain from the meditative object and avoid any kind of alteration of the meditative object. When we look at the yogic practices or the yogic trainings, we see that an individual can also practice yoga or meditation. All that one has to do is transfer first the object to the mind. So there is an object and you transfer that object to the mind. Then any kind of mental strain has to be removed from the meditative object, and then avoidance of any alteration of the meditative object happens itself. In the final stage of this meditative process, we see that the object ceases to be the object, since the subject-object relationship has been transcended. So when we talk about dualistic nature of subject and object, we see that in the final stage of meditative process, this duality comes to an end. The object and subject relationship comes to an end, where the object is no more an object and now it has become a part of that consciousness with the I of pragya, which is I, the meditator, sees the entity in form of void. He carries it back to the realm where it abides in itself, devoid of all adventitious relations. And so it is not the object of a subject. The Madhyant Vibhag teaches that the imagination of unreality creates dependent origination, that is called pratitya samutpad, and the unreal subject-object relation, and that liberation is achieved by elimination of this subject-object duality. It is no wonder then that Vasubandhu should write his two classic treatises about ideation only. But he does not forget the viewpoint of the Madhyant Vibhag, on which he wrote the basic commentary. The Buddhist path is principally in terms of mental training and reorienting, but the goal of Yogachar school was the condition of Dharma Dhatu or voidness free from subject-object duality, the condition called Parinispan. Then the imagination of unreality is in voidness and voidness in it. So the two inseparable reals are these. The distinctness of the two real is shown by such statements as whether or not a Tathagat arises, the void Dharma Dhatu abides, comparable to saying whether or not a potter arises. The void clay abides. So here what we are trying to say is that whether or not a Tathagat arises, the void Dharma Dhatu abides, and that can be compared whether or not a potter arises, the void clay abides. Immediately it follows that Tathagat, foremost being of all, and all other beings, selves, persons, pertain to the category of what can be called imagination of unreality. And all grades of matter, subtle or coarse, pertain to the void Dharma Dhatu. The inseparability of the two reals derive from the fact that man has devised this system of thought, and man cannot conceive of an act of thinking apart from a substantial vehicle for thought, and he cannot conceive of a form without a content. When we talk about this, the inseparability of the two reals, we see that it is derived from the fact that man has devised this system to thought, and man cannot conceive of an act of thinking apart from a substantial vehicle for thought, and cannot conceive of a form without a content. Now this is significant that the theory of three Buddha bodies arose in Yogachar school. They are, the one is called Dharmakaya, which is the body of natures, and is on the side of void absolute, the self-abiding dharma dhatu, which can also be called the realm of natures. The other two realms are Sambhogkai, which points out to the body of bliss, and Nirmankai, which points out to the body of transformation. And these are on the side of imagination of unreality, in the sense respectively of the Purush, which is person, and Maya, which means illusion creating power. Hence, Mahayana Buddhism teaches that Sambhogkai has 32 characteristics of the great person, and teaches that the Nirmankai has the power of magical creation of different bodies, comparable to the illusory power that is Maya. And these two expressions are based on the same Sanskrit root ma. So, the Yogacara school does have a subjective kind of idealistic philosophy which is limited only to formal cause. The mirage forms of things are no more real than the forms seen in dream. They are all projections of mind foundation or evolving mind, which is termed as Alya Vinyan or Pravritti Vinyan, Chit or Chet. And on the blank screen, which is more like voidness, that is the absolute in this system, pure substance of unlimited impressionability, capability and efficiency. So this is all about Vinyan. We see how Vinyan is termed in the ordinary sense, or how Vinyan is understood in the common sense. Then we see what Yogacharans have to say about Vinyan. Vinyan is that consciousness or awareness which for Yogachar school is the only real, and anything that lies outside this Vinyan, be it body or external objects, they are all unreal according to Yogachar. Now, as our title suggests, it is called the Doctrine of Pravritti Vinyan. We would be seeing what Pravritti Vinyan is. Pravritti Vinyan can be literally translated as functioning consciousness. As we know that this type of consciousness is already discussed in the classes of consciousness in module number 19. Now, here what we are going to do is elaborate this Pravritti Vinyan with proper example and explanations. This is third stage of evolution of consciousness and is determined as the awareness of object. So this is only the consciousness which is empirical in its discourse. This alone empirically known, the former two forms, it submerges base as it were. When we look at the practical purpose that constitutes our universe, we make use of Vinyan or awareness. Whatever is included, everything can be presented before the empirical reality. When we talk about the empirical reality, and when we say that according to Yogacharans, nothing beyond the mind is real, then the question that can arise is, how can we even talk about the empirical reality if there is nothing that is real? So to solve this problem, to solve this dichotomy of there being verbal communication and there being everything outside the mind unreal, Yogacharans came up with this solution that everything that we describe or the verbal communication is made possible only with the help of Vinyan, and that is also sometimes described as the mind. So it is all mental construction, and we have given different names to these mental constructions so that it is easy for us to communicate verbally in our day-to-day life. Our finite individual consciousness, which is Pravritti Vinyan, encompasses only what is made available to it through the five senses. When we talk about Vinyan or Pravritti Vinyan, we see that it encompasses only that is present through it through the five senses. And those senses are sense of sight, sense of hearing, sense of taste, sense of smell, and sense of touch. And these are part of the consciousness of 8 consciousness that are being defined or categorized according to Yogacar school. Individual consciousness is said to consist of 6 types of consciousness. Now, when we talk about Pravritti Vinyan, we are trying to say that it is the individual consciousness which is constituted by 6 types of consciousness. This has its own role in forming the awareness, and these 6 are: 1 is mental consciousness, 2nd is visual consciousness, 3rd is auditory consciousness, 4th is smelling consciousness, 5th is tasting consciousness, and 6th is tactile consciousness. So these 6 consciousness are classified into external and internal. The former includes all the above 5 senses which have their own functions, and that is to deliver the message to mind. And all comes external consciousness. In case of 6 senses, that is mental consciousness, comes under class of internal consciousness, the knowledge of ideas, and that is dharmas. The Manovinyan is not to be confused with Klisht Manovinyan. The latter is a transcendental function, while when we look at the former, we see that it merely belongs to knowledge of empirical reality. The sense data are certainly not objectively real, but consciousness has that form. On the class of objecthood, there would be no consciousness. It is seen in form of projection as to be projected as it is to project as an object. So here what we're trying to say is that empirical consciousness arise out of Alya Vinyan due to the presence of Alamban, Pratyaksh, that is objection or condition, one or many. Therefore, none of these 3 or 8 Vinyan is ultimate. Consciousness is disturbed owing to the impact of wrong idea. This evolution of consciousness must be understood merely in a logical sense and not as historical process. Now, when we talk about these types of consciousness, we see that how each consciousness works. We know that each consciousness has its own role in giving the information and making the thing aware. So these consciousness are important and are considered as sources of knowledge, and they are following. 1 is mental consciousness, then we have visual consciousness, then we have auditory consciousness, then we have smelling consciousness, tasting consciousness, and tactile consciousness. When we look at mental consciousness, we see that in this consciousness, all input of movement and sensation towards the object is maintained by the mental consciousness. It forms the task according to different parts of consciousness. Here, the knowledge which is gained is not necessary that it can be real, but mental acts as the thought construction of mind. So this is for the mental construction. we see that in mental consciousness, the knowledge that is gained is not necessary that it has to be real, because mental acts as the thought construction of mind. So this is the mental consciousness. Now, coming to the visual consciousness, it means the seeing of objects or the perception of objects. In this, object is seen through the eye organ and presentation of object is received towards eye consciousness. Then the object is transferred and it is signaled towards the mind, which helps to identify the nature of that object. And after that, so-called object appears in the universe. The gap between the eye and the object, which helps to recognize the thing, that is eye consciousness. When the eye gets in touch or in contact with the object of its consciousness, then whatever awareness or consciousness that arises is called eye consciousness. Then comes auditory consciousness. So first we have mental consciousness, then we have visual consciousness, now we have auditory consciousness. In this consciousness, the five organs called as ear work as tool factor to hear the sound of object in order to identify the reality of object. In this consciousness, it is not necessary that all objects have similar sound, but few objects can be produced or can give rise to different sounds. Therefore, through the sound of object, one can identify the types of object and its nature, because we are so accustomed to do so. When we hear a particular sound or when we smell a particular scent, we see that, or maybe perfume, we see that, okay, this is similar or familiar to what I have been using. So this all task controlled by ear consciousness. Now we come to next consciousness, which is smelling consciousness. In this consciousness, the nose organ works as the part of smelling consciousness. Through the fragrances of an object, one can identify the object and nature of anything that is also understood. This provides the knowledge of the object to be recognized. So this is smelling consciousness. After this, we have tasting consciousness. This consciousness helps to identify the object with the help of taste. When we taste a particular thing, we get different tastes, tasting different things. So that points out to the different sources of taste buds that are present in our tongue, and that makes us realize whether whatever we are tasting is sweet, salty, bitter, sour, or tasteless. Here the organ called help as tool factor to know the object. Through this, one can know whether the object is either bitter or sweet in taste. This act sends the information to our mind, and then our mind comes under an action. Then after tasting consciousness comes tactile consciousness. In this consciousness, one is aware of the knowledge of object by touching. The organ used is hands. Through touching, we can know whether water is cold or hot, or whether anything for that matter is cold, hot, painful, or joyous, and what types of object it is. The touch of object produces the sensation to our mind, then it is determined that the message has been received from the organs. Now here, when we talk about visually challenged people, we see that mostly they touch everything in order to see, in order to feel, instead of their perception, instead of their eyes playing the role. Their hands play a role in understanding what a thing is. Therefore, through this tactile consciousness, we can call touching the object as that consciousness which has arisen. This is all about pravritti vinyan and its function in Buddhism. So we've seen what is pravritti vinyan. It is the individual consciousness, and it constitutes of these 6 different kinds of consciousness which provide the knowledge of object from the ultimate and conventional point of view. When we look at it from the ultimate point of view, we see that it gives us the knowledge of what things are or how things are, and from seeing it from the empirical point of view, we see that it gives a better understanding of the external reality which has been refuted by Yogacara Buddhism. Therefore, it points out to the process in which these externally refuted objects are sent to the mind or chit, and they are formed into verbal communications. So when we look at the objects, the process states that the object goes to the mind, where the mind plays its function in constructing that object, and once the construction takes place, then there is the understanding of that object. It gives out 8 kinds of consciousness that plays the role in forming conceptual constructions of the phenomenal existence. When we have these 8 types of consciousness, we see that there is Alya Vinyan which lies there, and Alya Vinyan plays the role of storehouse consciousness. And these objects or things that we talk about are all experienced before, and they are latent in the mind, from where they are being brought forward, and they talk about these 8 types of consciousness, where pravritti vinyan points out to the individual consciousness. Thank you.